Welcome to the National Archives Know Your Records program. My name is Andrea Bassing-Matney. We are broadcasting live from the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. with a live on-site audience. Before we begin, I have a few tips I'd like to share with you. For those of you here with us on site, we have several handouts, and hopefully you have picked those up. And we will be taking questions at the end of the presentation. We ask that you use these aisle microphones when you're ready to make those questions at the end. For those of you watching online, from this YouTube webpage, you can also ask questions using the chat feature on YouTube. You will also find several hot links to the presentation slides, to handouts, and live captioning. Today we are pleased to have Claire Kluskens offer her genealogy presentation entitled Using Records of Artificial Limbs for Union Civil War Veterans. She will discuss records from 1861 to 1927 in the National Archives that may give information about a veteran's medical condition and whether he received money or an artificial limb from the U.S. government. Ms. Kluskens is a project archivist. Let's switch this over. Ms. Kluskens is a projects archivist specializing in immigration, census, military, and other records of high genealogical value. She has spearheaded the completion of more than 310 National Archives microfilm publications and now works on digital projects. She frequently lectures and writes for national, state, and local genealogical publications. Claire has been on the staff of the National Archives since 1992 and a genealogist since 1976. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our presenter, Claire Kluskens. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today in person and online. The National Archives, as you may know, preserves and provides access to the permanently valuable records of the United States federal government. This task we do in perpetuity on behalf of the American people, and thank you for taking an interest in those records. In this presentation, we're going to talk about records that show whether a Union Civil War veteran was amputated and whether he received either an artificial limb or money from the federal government. The research guide that is online, along with today's PowerPoint and lecture, will provide you the nitty-gritty details you need to get access to the records discussed in today's lecture. So I invite your attention to that guide. Some of the records discussed here today can be useful for veterans of other Civil War, all Civil War veterans, while other, While other records are very specialized and are only relevant to amputees. The American Civil War was the first to result in thousands of amputations. New technology was largely to blame. The invention and use of the mini-ball, a rifle made of soft lead with a hollow base, expanded when fired and caused large, irregular, and slow-healing wounds upon impact. Infection and gangrene set in quickly. Faced with shattered bones, shredded tissue, and limited medical knowledge, resources, and options, amputation actually offered the best chance of survival. By war's end, about 60,000 soldiers on both sides suffered amputation. A skilled and experienced surgeon could remove a limb in 5 minutes. Speed was critical to minimize blood loss and length of anesthesia by chloroform or ether. The overall survival rate, The overall survival rate was 75%, but varied depending upon the location of the surgery. Loss of part of the foot was survived by 96%, while amputation at the hip joint was survived by only 17%. Later in the war, resection, that's R-E-S-E-C-T-I-O-N, became more common. This technique involved removing only the injured section of the arm or leg, leaving a shortened, less functional limb. Nearly 40% of amputations resulted only in the loss of fingers or toes. The war and industrial accidents caused a surge in demand for artificial limbs, which needed replacement and repair every 5 years. Needed replacement every 5 years as well as frequent repair. Clever entrepreneurs responded to this business opportunity through invention and manufacturing. Nearly 150 patents for artificial limb designs were issued between 1861 and 1873. In 1872, Congress authorized the Army Surgeon General to purchase artificial limbs for disabled soldiers and seamen, and in 1868 extended that benefit to officers. In 1866, Congress authorized the Secretary of War to provide free transportation to veterans between home and the artificial limb manufacturer. In 1870, Congress authorized veterans to receive a new limb or apparatus for resection every 5 years, then increased the frequency to every 3 years in 1891. Veterans who did not want a limb or who could not wear one could instead obtain money, called commutation, at the rate of $75 for each leg, $50 for each arm or foot, and $50 for apparatus for resection. In 1874, Congress decided that veterans who lost an arm at or above the elbow or a leg at or above the knee could receive a pension of $24 per month instead of receiving commutation or an artificial limb. Veterans often chose commutation instead of a limb. Some could not wear one due to lack of a stump, discomfort from inadequate tissue surrounding the remaining bone, or chronic infection. Others went without because an empty sleeve or trouser leg made a man's patriotic sacrifice visible and commendable. Programs involving money or benefits caused records to be created. The artificial limb and commutation program needed to document which soldiers were paid, when, and how much. This presentation will follow one man through the records. His name was DeWitt Clinton Ayers of Rochester, Beaver County, Pennsylvania. He served as a private in Company I, 102nd Pennsylvania Infantry. The Veterans Compiled Military Service Record, or CMSR, provides an outline of a man's service and may give evidence of wounding or loss of limb. Every Union Civil War veteran has a CMSR for each regiment in which he served. They are called compiled military service records because the information was compiled from original records. From the 1880s to the 1910s, clerks in the Adjutant General Office copied information from original muster rolls, payrolls, and other records onto cards and put those cards into an envelope called a jacket. It was a time-consuming project, but it provided quick access to most of the records about a veteran's service in one location. DeWitt CMSRs for his service in Company I, 102nd Pennsylvania Infantry, include several records mentioning his injury. This is the jacket or envelope in which there are 28 cards providing information about his service in the 102nd Pennsylvania. Towards the bottom, you see the number 7 that indicates there are 7 so-called personal papers inside the jacket as well. Let's take a look. Here, for example, is one of those 28 cards. A company muster roll indicates that DeWitt Clinton Ayers enlisted for 3 years and mustered in on August 16, 1861 at Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This information is from the muster roll dated August 31, 1861. Muster roll information is a typical kind of record that you would find in most soldiers' compiled military service records. Turning now to the personal papers jacket inside Mr. Ayers' CMSR, we might find things such as enlistment papers, discharge papers, a casualty sheet, medical descriptive list, or other medical records, and so forth. These things are called personal papers because they relate to only one man, in contrast to records like muster rolls, which relate to many men. Here is his 1864 re-enlistment paper. This is the front side. And here is the back side of the re-enlistment paper. CMSRs often have re-enlistment papers, but not the original enlistment paper for the man's first enlistment. Here is the casualty sheet that simply indicates that DeWitt was wounded on May 5, 1864, and that his regiment was part of the 2nd Corps, 6th Division. All that text in the lower half indicates that the report of killed, wounded, and missing for the period May 5 to July 10, which is what this was compiled from, was unsigned, but that Brigadier General George W. Getty was in command on July 10 when the report was made. And this is the reverse side. So the casualty sheet does not provide much information. Here is a hospital record called a medical descriptive list for DeWitt Ayers that refers to a fractured femur and amputation at the thigh. This record does not clearly identify the hospital. However, the December 24, 1864 admission date is a clue. We are able to identify this record as being from the U.S. Army General Hospital No. 1 in Annapolis, Maryland, due to a different record that we will see later in this presentation. Thus, as in all research, a clue from one record can help you with another record. And this is the other side where most of the information is. It indicates the wound was received at the Battle of the Wilderness and goes into more detail about the exact nature of the wound. He was actually wounded in both legs, and the missile passed through the right knee, and as far as the left leg, the stump healed without any unfavorable complication. After a long period of hospitalization, Ayers was discharged from military service 10 months after his injury. And here's the main side where most of the information is. It is dated at U.S. General Hospital No. 1 in Annapolis, Maryland, March 13, 1865, and indicates that he suffered compound gunshot fractures to his left leg while in action at the Battle of the Wilderness on May 5, 1864. It indicates amputation resulted at the lower third of the leg and that he was totally disabled. When you find a reference to a place in the record, be curious about that place and learn something about it, because that will enhance your understanding of your ancestors' life and experience. Ayers was discharged from U.S. Army General Hospital No. 1, which was on the grounds of the U.S. Naval Academy. It consisted of long rows of one-story structures erected as hospital buildings for wounded Northern troops and for sick men recently released from Confederate prisons. Annapolis was easily accessible by railroad trains from Washington and the Virginia battlefields, as well as within convenient distance by sea from Fortress Monroe in southern Virginia, and other points where sick and wounded men could be assembled. This hospital is known as U.S. Army General Hospital No. 1, while in the rear of St. John's College stood a smaller hospital known as U.S. Army General Hospital No. 2. Carded medical records are another source of information about men's hospitalizations and wounds. These records often contain hospital information that is not in the compiled military service records, and many Union Civil War soldiers have carded medical records. Ayers was in the hospital of the 2nd Division 6th Army Corps immediately following the Battle of the Wilderness. There are several cards like this one on the left, because he is listed in different pages in the hospital's record. You'll recall that the casualty sheet we saw earlier from his CMSR also indicates his initial treatment at this hospital. Next, on the right, Ayers was put aboard a ship, the U.S. Army Hospital steamer Connecticut, at Port Royal, Virginia on May 25, 1864. Thus, 3 weeks after his wounding, he was stable enough to endure some travel. The next day, May 26, 1864, Ayers was admitted to Lincoln General Hospital, Washington, D.C. This is the card on the left. Opened in December 1862, Lincoln General was the largest of the military hospitals in the Washington area built by the Army to take care of Civil War casualties. It was located on Capitol Hill, 15 blocks east of the Capitol building. The hospital complex had over 2,500 beds. Besides kitchen and dining rooms, there were staff quarters, a water tank, laundry, barber shop, carpenter shop, stables, and a morgue. Like most other military hospitals, Lincoln General was taken down shortly after the war. On the next card on the right, from the records of Lincoln General Hospital, it says that Ayers was furloughed on July 26, 1864, so it's possible he went home to his family at that time. 6 months later, the next card here indicates that Ayers was admitted to Division No. 1, U.S. Army General Hospital at Annapolis on December 21, 1864, and discharged from service March 14, 1865, as we have seen from his discharge certificate. So the carded medical records help flesh out some of the details of his treatment and convalescence after being wounded. Pension files for Union Civil War veterans are also extremely important sources of information about the veteran and his life after the war. They can be valuable sources of information about his immediate family if he had a widow or minor children who applied for a pension. This sequence of pictures is meant to give you an idea of the scope of Civil War pension files. In the first box, one file is extended upward from the box. It is one of 14 files in that box. In the middle picture, you see 2 rows of Civil War pension files, and in the final picture, you see rows upon rows filled only with Civil War pension files, and that's only some of them. The pension file for DeWitt C. Ayres contains several mentions of his war injuries. We will look at just a couple records. The examining surgeon's report here, dated June 9, 1886, details his injuries and his current condition. Here is the front side. Many veterans had to report every year or two to a board of surgeons who would verify the veteran's eligibility for benefits based on his current medical condition. Men like DeWitt Ayres, who were obviously permanently disabled, would usually get exempted from future examinations. This report stated that DeWitt's conical-shaped stump was numb and painful, and the resulting cicatrix, or scar, is large, indurated, adherent, and tender. An anatomical diagram on the reverse side shows both the location of his left leg amputation plus a gunshot entrance above his surviving right knee, which was painful and weak. Another record in his pension file is his application for commutation, or money, dated January 9, 1871, shown here. It notes he previously received from the United States an artificial leg made by Jewett of Washington, D.C. So that's the first reference to an artificial leg. Pension files have many records, but I've only shown a couple that are most relevant to his artificial limb. Next, we'll turn to the specialized records in Record Group 15, records of the Department of Veterans Affairs, in the custody of the National Archives here in Washington, D.C. I should note that while the Army Surgeon General was responsible for certifying eligibility for the artificial limb program, the Pension Office distributed payments. There are 10 record series that relate to artificial limbs, trusses, or commutation furnished to Civil War and later veterans, and they take up 2 shelves shown here. A good place to start is the list of persons furnished artificial limbs and commutation, which is a giant volume measuring 18 inches by 12 inches by 4 inches. It lists veterans alphabetically by name and gives each man's unit, date of first application for limb or commutation, and the number of limbs received or paid for at 5-year intervals, being approximately 1870, 1875, 1880, 1885, 1890, and 1895. Dead or rejected is noted for some men. DeWitt C. Ayres, again from Company I, 102nd Pennsylvania Infantry, first applied January 12, 1871, and again at roughly 5-year intervals after that date to approximately 1895. And there is a reference here on his line to the January 12, 1871 application, his application for commutation money that we saw in his pension file. He's the second to last man shown there on that page. The 11 volumes of Registers of Persons Furnished Artificial Limbs and Commutation, which spans 1870 to 1927, provide the bulk of the documentation for most veterans. Most volumes have an alphabetical index that indicates the page containing further information. In addition to the veteran's name, each entry usually gives the veteran's rank, unit, current residence, date of injury, which arm or leg injured, amount of payment, date of commutation certificate or payment, and other information. Page 1 of the first volume explains many of the abbreviations used in that and subsequent volumes. So here from volume 2 is the index entry for DeWitt Ayres. He's the second from the bottom, which indicates that he's on page 34. And turning to page 34, we have here the entry for February 4, 1871, and he's the first man on the page, and it indicates his residence in Rochester, Pennsylvania, his unit that we've spoken of before, that he lost his left leg May 5, 1864, and he's getting a commutation certificate for $75. Continuing to volume 3, which covers June of 1875 to June 1877, on page, we find him in the index, which tells us to go to page 395, and on page 395, we find that his next application for a $75 commutation certificate was approved March 15, 1877. Moving next to volume 5, he's on page 173, actually he's on page 431, sorry. We find that Ayers had ordered a leg from manufacturer George R. Fuller. The notation no order account likely indicates that the $75 payment was authorized on May 7, 1881 to be sent directly to the manufacturer. Going next to volume 8, he's on page 345. Volume 8 covers June of 1885 to June 1887. And we find authorization for March 27, 1886 for a $75 payment and transportation to manufacturer George R. Fuller, who was in Rochester, New York. As we learned from a different records series discussed below, the $75 still had not been paid either to Ayers or Fuller by mid-1888. Then in volume 9, which covers July 1887 to June 1911, we find authorization for Ayers' $75 payment and transportation to manufacturer J.E. Hanger, who was actually only about 30 miles from where Ayers lived. And the February 4/91 account reference likely indicates the date of an invoice submitted by Hanger. And in the same volume, on page 363, is an authorization in 1897 for yet another $75 payment. No further entries for DeWitt C. Ayers were found between 1897 and his death in 1914. It is possible that he received an increase in his pension that disqualified him from further artificial limb commutation payments. Finally, the single volume shown here of letters sent relating to prosthetic appliances, commutation, and transportation reimbursement, 1885 to 1892, includes a fair copy of a letter written to Ayers. And in this letter, we find more information about the procedure used to obtain an artificial limb, as well as a problem with Ayers' 1886 leg order. It recounts that the Surgeon General issued an order on March 27, 1886, for George R. Fuller to make an artificial limb pursuant to Ayers' January 1886 application. Fuller made the leg but didn't get paid. More than 2 years later, on December 12, 1888, Fuller sent the Surgeon General an undated receipt written in pencil by Ayers as proof of delivery of the leg. The Surgeon General's office was unwilling to accept the undated pencil note, so Chief Clerk Samuel Ramsey wrote to Ayers to request that Ayers write in ink an acknowledgement of receipt of the leg. What are the next research steps? And here's the letter expanded a little bit more there. What are the next research steps? Researchers can learn about the construction, features, usefulness, and durability of 19th century artificial limbs through newspaper advertisements, patent records published by the Commissioner of Patents, and publications issued by the manufacturers and others. Further research is needed to determine if more information can be learned about Ayers' pre-1871 DeWitt leg from other records in the National Archives. In summary, DeWitt C. Ayers' compiled military service record and pension file provide details about the circumstances that caused his amputation and its subsequent effects on his life. The commutation certificate in his pension file informs us he received an artificial leg manufactured by Benjamin W. Jewett of Washington, D.C., sometime before 1871. From specialized records in Record Group 15, we learn that Ayers received money in 1871 and 1877. He obtained an artificial leg in 1881 and 1886 from manufacturer George R. Fuller of Rochester, New York, who had a little trouble getting paid for that 1886 leg. Ayers then obtained new legs in 1891 and 1897 from manufacturer James Edward Hanger, who had a factory in Pittsburgh, 30 miles from Ayers' home, as well as in 5 other major cities. The numerous amputations suffered during the American Civil War boosted a new industry, prosthetics, that continues to innovate and improve mobility products needed by American veterans returning home from today's military missions. And I'm now open for questions.
Thank you so much, Claire. Thank you, Claire.
So I have a question.
Okay, please go ahead.
Entry 17 volume, the large volume,
Yes.
is that available in the research room that we can personally use, or do we have to work with an archivist to review it?
You have to request it in the finding aids room, and then they will deliver it. It will be delivered to the central research room for you to use.
Oh, wow, okay. And then, of course, it's listed alphabetically
Yes.
for all the veterans in all those subsequent 5-year
Intervals.
periodic volumes.
That's right.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, Claire. We have another question that came online. This is from Betty Lou Burton. She is wondering about a soldier ancestor who was a soldier during the Civil War period, but not necessarily in the Civil War. Her question is, would someone who served and lost a leg in Dakota Territory during the time of the Civil War still be considered a Civil War veteran since he was on the Indian frontier?
I think it is worth consulting these records for. I assume that if he's in the Dakota Territory, he was probably in the regular Army, which means he wouldn't have a compiled military service record unless he's in one of those, unless he's in a unit that has a compiled military service record that was part of the volunteer forces. Okay, that's a confusing answer on that part. So let me break it down this way. He may have a compiled military service record that I talked about if he was in a quote-unquote volunteer unit. Volunteer units had a state name as part of the designation, whereas he might actually have been in the regular U.S. Army, which would have a U.S. designation, such as 1st U.S. Infantry. But probably the place she should start first would be the pension file, if he has one, to see if there is reference to losing a leg, and she may have already done that, or an arm or what have you. And if that's the case, then I think she should look into these records, because I believe they should have other veterans who were not, directly in the Civil War.
Thank you, Claire. I'll follow up for Betty Lou since she's not here with us and online. Would she find anything about her ancestor in the Dakota Territory, if she were anything local, if she's in that area?
Again, I'm not sure exactly what time period that you're talking about there, or what kind of local records that might exist outside of what the military was collecting about its own people that were serving in the Army. I would need more information to be able to answer that kind of question.
Thank you, Claire. We have another question that just popped up. It's from Jan Murphy. Jan asks, do you have a sense of how many times or how often veterans were refitted for artificial limbs? Was it common for veterans to try limbs from different manufacturers?
I would say that it was common to get refitted for limbs because, your body does change as you age. And these limbs were not made to last forever. They were assumed to last 5 years, but still require some repairs in the meantime. And as we saw with DeWitt C. Ayers, he had, over the course of his lifetime, limbs made by 3 different manufacturers: Benjamin Jewett of Washington, D.C., Hanger of Pittsburgh, and George Fuller of Rochester. So I would say yes, I would expect they would try different manufacturers.
Thank you, Claire. So it sounds to me like just because you found one record indicating that your ancestor has gotten money or a limb, that you should not assume that that's the only record, that maybe you should continue looking further down the line and into the future.
That he got more than one limb in their lifetime. Whether you can prove that is the next step.
Thank you so much. I'm looking online and I do not see any more questions. Do we have any other questions here from our on-site audience? Well, thank you so much, Claire. I appreciate your time. We will keep these presentation materials available online. If you didn't have an opportunity to watch live, you can send your questions to us afterwards. Thank you so much, Claire.
Okay, thank you, Andrea.